Welcome. Thank you so much for coming here today and joining us as we start our conversations on ecologies of care for this workshop. The title of my talk is Living a Sherpa. And my early climate change research focused on Sherpa perceptions and institutional responses to climate change effects in the Mount Everest region. This research testing indigenous perceptions against scientific reality fit an accepted model of anthropological climate change research at that time. So this is around 2000, between 2009 and 2012 when I was working on my dissertation, doctoral dissertation. So the study revealed inherent biases against indigenous knowledge in climate change research and shed light on the differences in how community experienced climate change and how detached institutional narratives circulating in the Mount Everest region were from the ground reality. As a way to better understand institutional climate change adaptation resources available for indigenous communities, then, I examined climate policies and infrastructure at the national and regional levels. Although Nepalis were already adapting to everyday realities of climate change in a variety of ways with differentiated climate vulnerabilities across and within communities, as my previous research had shown, it was clear from my later study that communities at the local level were continued to be treated as passive recipients of top-down techno-managerial institutional adaptation interventions based on Euro-Western scientific understanding of climate change. So in 2018, I was invited to participate in two IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, contextualizing challenges faced by indigenous communities, particularly in the cryospheric regions where water freezes into snow or ice. My latest engagement with climate science at the global scale through the IPCC process further exposed existing institutional mechanisms that prohibit open and robust dialogue across physical sciences and the social sciences. While there were important findings from my climate change research, they were not sufficient in proactively addressing questions of intergenerational survival under the unprecedented conditions of anthropogenic climate change that are important to indigenous communities in the Himalayas. So I've thus tried to turn to now the critical indigenous studies and the emergent work focused on climate change that employ decolonizing and indigenous methodologies to address issues of direct concern to indigenous communities for my latest research project. Employing these approaches, I foreground indigenous agency and not victimhood, and wisdom as guiding light to live with climate change. In the process, this project demonstrates the significance of engaging with multiple knowledges to address questions that concern well-being of humanity in the context of climate and nature emergency. So this work on advancing knowledge pluralism and the call for justice-oriented climate studies, my work with Dr. Ritodi Chakraborty here and Dr. Costanza Rampini, who's not here today but might join us later. Though our work collectively aims to expand how climate changes, our understanding of how climate change is unfolding for indigenous communities in the Himalayas. So this multidisciplinary research project, Living, a Sherpa offering to an ailing planet, examines how ancestral knowledge and place-based wisdom have been engaged with and transmitted intergenerationally. Drawing on extensive fieldwork and indigenous autoethnography, it documents and analyzes Sherpa lived experiences with climate change. And the project constitutes a critical review of institutional responses to climate change, again, which at the moment treats community as a homogeneous, static, and passive recipients of institutional resources and scientific knowledge. So, through this work, I show how the values and wisdom have guided the community to survive world-altering changes and expand the notion of sustainability as one grounded in the relationships that nurture the continuity of a people, the Sherpas. So the project foregrounds indigenous Sherpa values and methods to make this personal offering from my side for the well-being of humanity. The project explores the complexity of grappling with the experience of change, labor, and home for Sherpas, and presents the values that have guided the last 3 generations through dramatic changes on our ancestral lands and in the new places we call home today. So there are 3 objectives here that I'm working with. First one, to examine the values that have guided the last 3 generations of Sherpas through dramatic socioeconomic and environmental changes, like I just said, but not only on our ancestral lands, but also the diaspora, because a lot of the Himalayan communities actually also live elsewhere and have moved to elsewhere. So the notion of diaspora and the experience in diaspora is very important to consider if we are considering Himalayan people's experience. So, and all of this I do to understand survival as a lived practice. And secondly, to document and analyze Sherpa lived experiences in Khumbu and the diaspora again, foregrounding the agency of Sherpa individuals and the community. So what kinds of agency do they have or do they already practice? And thirdly, to demonstrate the act of offering itself. So I keep referring to offering again and again in my talk. I'm happy to discuss this further during the Q&A, but really to demonstrate the act of offering itself as an indigenous Sherpa methodology of inviting the audience to engage with intergenerational wisdom that is based on care, respect, and critical self-reflection, so it can provide a humanity-based framework for critical analysis. So, a little bit of the context. The project explores Sherpa lived experiences, all of this, the analysis and the discussion of Sherpas at the planetary scale and responding to the scale of humanity, in this case, is a call to adjust our analytical skills in Himalayan studies to meet the reality of indigenous peoples today. So we often tend to think about indigenous peoples only in local sense, as local people. But what I'm really doing with this project is really pushing that and saying we need to be thinking about Himalayan people at the planetary scale, able to address world problems. So in following Sherpa people across time, space, and circumstance, I tell our story as one that is woven into and through global patterns of temporal and bodily flows. It is a story about us, the Sherpas, asserting our existence in the volatility of climate crisis. So whether you're living in Yangjee in Khumbu or whether you're living in New York, climate change does not spare us. The project asserts Sherpa indigeneity as I reflect on my positionality as a Sherpa mother, scholar, and teacher. Sherpa relationality, where humans and non-humans co-inhabit the many dimensions of the world, and Sherpa temporality, where living and dying are interconnected phases in the cycle of time, provide the foundational principle for this project. So my personal offering is based on reflections on the many journeys I've taken away from home in Kathmandu and Farak to North America and finding my way back, each journey protected by the blessings of my grandparents, my parents, and extended relatives. It is also based on the multi-sited ethnographic fieldwork conducted over the last 20 years in the Himalayas and North America among Sherpas pursuing questions of indigeneity, migration, and climate change. So I describe the Sherpa cultural world from my vantage point as a Sherpa anthropologist from Farak, Greater Khumbu region, currently living on Musqueam land in British Columbia, through an engagement with Sherpa studies and Himalayan studies, with a special attention to the contributions from within political ecology. I apply critical indigenous studies framework to center Sherpa ontology and epistemology within my inquiries. So the three sets of literature I'm engaging with, so the multidisciplinary analysis is in, my multidisciplinary analysis is in dialogue with three sets of literature. First one is the anthropological theories of the last 2 decades on more than human, multi-species, the Anthropocene, and the ontological turn. Secondly, multiscalar interdisciplinary scientific examination of climate change and its impact on indigenous communities. And thirdly, critical indigenous scholarship of the global north, where my work has found a home to center Sherpa ontology and epistemology. So contemporary debates on ecological and civil crisis in a post-pandemic world emanating from indigenous feminist and Black feminist studies have guided my assessment of racism, capitalism, and colonialism in the context of climate crisis. So in all of this, living and dying have surfaced inexorably in my ongoing study of climate change impacts on indigenous peoples. This project therefore gleans wisdom for relational caring through a rigorous and self-reflexive account of the fractures and sutures of Sherpa culture and identity to make this offering of living as a theory. So this project presents a theory of living based on the Himalayan concept of Korwa, which translates loosely into life cycle, highlighted by Sienna Craig, where living and dying are inseparable, interdependent phases in the cycle of time. Rooted in the Himalayas, this theory lives to grow and change, continually nurtured by the works of indigenous scholars from the region and around the world, including our very own Dolly Kikon. In the Himalayas, Uttam Lal and Karisma Lepcha invite us to consider the ruin in the landscape as a witness to its own cycle of life and death, and the entire gamut of processes which encompass socio-political and economic impacts in an area. To understand living and dying here thus requires a consideration of the processes of socio-political and economic changes and their impacts on the land, as well as the earthquakes that shake the land, raising deep cultural anxieties for lay indigenous peoples, as Mabel Gergen shows. So living is also, as Dolly Keegan has revealed, it is about the social bonds established through the practices and processes of relationship with the land. She focuses on people's love for the landscape and for the state, as well as for family, friends, and neighbors. Khalsang Dorji Bhutia reminds us of the active agency of mountains in its ongoing relationship with humans, and the relationships humans have with other beings, including foxes, yetis, bulls, and trees. The flourishing of life is based on the care and attentiveness in the form of offerings to these various human, non-human relationships, according to Bhutia. So I bring this theory of living from the Himalayas in conversation with the Quechua concept of sumak koisui, and I'm sorry, I am not, I don't know how to pronounce this. So my apologies. And the more popular incarnation of the term buen vivir, living well. So Vanessa de Oliveira reveals the difference between having enough, embodied in the concept of living well, versus striving for more, as modernity prescribes, embodied in the concept of living better. So it's living well versus living better, different ways of thinking about our experience. So Deborah McGregor notes the use of buen vivir by Indigenous peoples in the document Rio +20 International Conference of Indigenous Peoples on Self-Determination and Sustainable Development. She explains that the concept calls for living well within an expanded view of community, which includes the planet and everything on it, animals, plants, the earth itself, or what she refers to as all of creation. She also points to the Anishinaabe concept, again, I'm going to apologize, Minomna Mozwen, Zoin, the ideal that ensures a sustainable future for all life. So building on these indigenous teachings from different places to develop the theory of living, I then returned to Robin Kimmerer to remember the moral covenant of reciprocity, which calls us to honor our responsibilities for all we have been given and for all that we have taken in return for the privilege of breath. So my personal assertion of Sherpa indigeneity, informed by the study of indigenous realism, a concept of Daniel Wildcat's, indigenous ingenuity or indigenuity, again, Daniel Wildcat, and Kyle White's epistemologies of coordination is a responsibility that has led me to this project on living. And I'll talk about that for the next couple of minutes. So, Sherpa indigeneity, thinking with Jeff Korntassel on indigenous articulation, self-determination, and resurgence, Eve Talk on suspending damage, and Bernard Purley on emergent vitalities of language, culture, and identity, I argue that an understanding of indigeneity requires us to have the courage to move beyond the nation state and center indigenous voices, experiences, and worldviews. I extend that argument into the complex and specific histories of the Himalayan region of South Asia. I evoke Sherwi Phum, the indigenous way of identifying myself as a Sherpa's daughter, to ground this project in the indigenous Sherpa ways of knowing and being. Sherwi Phum is the powerful core within the matriarch that is wise, grounded, rooted, unafraid, and unconstrained. The qualities we have inherited from our ancestors from generations of survival on the highest, one of the harshest places on the planet. Indigenous realism and indigeneity. So I invoke indigenous realism, Daniel Wildcat, that inform us, members of humankind, to accept our inalienable responsibilities as members of the planet's complex life system, as well as our inalienable rights as indigenous peoples. So in order to accept our inalienable responsibilities, Wildcat alerts us that we must now pay attention to what is happening in the natural world beyond the physical walls that enclose us and the alluring media windows we ironically look and listen to in order to feel connected. Indigeneity, then, is an affirmation and realization that practical knowledges emerge when we take our membership in the ecological and kinship community in which we live. We need to be mindful of our relationships with the relatives, not resources, with whom we share the planet. And the third one, epistemologies of coordination. In Against Crisis Epistemology, Potawatomi scholar Kyle White demonstrates that an epistemology of crisis organizes knowledge in ways that emphasize some narrative of the imminence of a threat to the present and validate the violation of moral bonds that happens when kinship relationships and the time to develop them are not realized. Epistemology of coordination, on the other hand, draws attention to the problems of how presentism and imminence can betray ethics and justice. Epistemologies of coordination are ways of knowing the world that emphasizes the moral bonds of kinship relationships for generating the responsible capacity to respond to constant change. So I'll stop there, but with this final remark here, bringing me back to Dolly's question of what does care work look like. And when we were thinking together about this workshop and the kind of work we want to do together, one of the things that I could not stop thinking about is this reality here. And when we were having this discussion, I was also thinking about it from a Kathmandu experience. So this summer, in April, May, we had the worst air pollution because of all of the fires. And I've never seen Kathmandu as dry as I saw this year. And then I was there just a few weeks ago, and the heavy rain flooding that happened. And also in August, we had our ancestral village in Kumbu, Tami village, flooded, and it has been damaged because of the sudden glacial lake outburst flood. And this glacial lake was formed just in the last 5-10 years. And it was small. However, the destruction it caused was huge. And so in all of this, I'm also thinking about the unimaginable disparities whose stories get told and whose experiences get recorded and registered. And all of this continues to stay with me, and I'm continuing to meditate on what it means to live with climate change, because it's no longer for me as somebody from Kumbu, where the glaciers are melting as we speak and have been melting for a very long time, and the Sherpas have known this fact for a long time, but have never been included as equal partners in decision-making spaces. So for me, the care work really is to now think about our survival as people, as community, and what that means, and what we can do, and how we pool our resources and think collectively. And in this case, Sherpas alone cannot do it, cannot respond to this situation alone. It requires community work, it requires care work, and this is where I'll end. Thank you. Tujin.